our work on an intervention is a lot less progress than Anastasia's, but I guess I'm want to frame it in terms of like some of the questions that led to this work, and I guess some of the questions that it raises in terms of understanding around early intervention in general in Prader-Willi syndrome. So it's about can we use early intervention to strengthen the cognitive capacity that people with Prader-Willi syndrome have to deal with change. And just starting my acknowledgements, a lot of families with children with Prader-Willi syndrome took part in the research that I'm going to talk about. So they're the ones that need to have the biggest thanks. But Siobhan Blackwell was a research associate who worked in my team at the time we were doing this project. So she coordinated a lot of the work. And then you can see some of our collaborators and funders on the slide. So when we talk about cognition in people with Prader-Willi syndrome, we often hear this term sort of executive dysfunction, and that's referring to problems in executive skills, which are the higher level cognitive processes that allow us to control and regulate all of our thoughts and behaviours. But I guess specifically within Prader-Willi syndrome, we're thinking more specifically about this cognitive inflexibility that Anastasia mentioned, which I guess is it's rigidity in responding to how the adapting environment is affecting the person. And then I guess even more specifically within cognitive inflexibility, we've talked about this thing called task switching deficits. So I often use this example of a boiled egg when I'm talking about task switching, because it's changing from thinking about one thing in a particular way to thinking about the same thing in a different way. So with the boiled egg, you have to think about the spoon sometimes as a hammer when you're smashing open the shell, and sometimes as a spoon when you're using it to eat the egg. And work we did quite a long time ago now showed the neurofunctional atypicalities that people with Prader-Willi syndrome show when they're engaging with task switching, that really suggest that there's a neural underpinning of those deficits. But then what does this mean in terms of behaviour? That's where we get onto constructs that we see in the scientific literature, but also in some of the practice literature. We hear about terms like preference for predictability or routine, resistance to change, and intolerance to uncertainty. And the reason that I'm highlighting those terms is because we hear them sometimes more commonly in other populations, but actually some of those wider populations, for example, autistic children, there's been quite a lot more early intervention work than there has been in Prader-Willi syndrome population. So I think it's important to have that connection at a conceptual level. Basically, in Prader-Willi syndrome, what we mean when we're talking about this kind of difficulty with things changing is things like restricted conversation about what's going to happen in the future, or the wanting things to be as they have done before. So this, if something's done in a particular way, then a preference to have it done in that same way again. And also a lot of questions if things change. But then I guess particularly importantly for a lot of the work that we've done, when things change, that's a particularly risky time for when you can see negative emotional behaviour and temper outbursts, or what we're calling now emotional outbursts. And actually, if we think about triggers for emotional outbursts in people with Prader-Willi syndrome, changes to routines or expectations are one of the most important triggers. So I guess what we wanted to do then is to try to develop an early intervention approach that would try to tackle this cognitive problem with task switching, to have a beneficial effect on this resistance to change. And when we're looking to current best practice, a lot of what we see in the scientific and practice literature is linked again to autistic populations, and we see a lot of reference to the importance of structuring routines and structuring environments. So this was just a quick Google search that I did recently for today's presentation, just finding some guides around needing to stick to schedule and staying consistently on schedule. But of course, so that makes sense in that if you have a child who has difficulty with change, then of course, if we try to stick to a particular schedule or particular schedules that are understood by the child, then we're necessarily going to have fewer problems when we stick to those schedules because we've got less changes going on. So it makes a lot of sense. But we come to a problem when we're not able to stick to a particular schedule. And a lot of families certainly have told us that it's just impractical to always keep to particular schedules. And I think more importantly, from our perspective, when we're thinking about the cognition, we identified a few different lines of evidence that suggests that actually too much structure at an early age might be problematic when we're thinking about trying to support the development of those cognitive skills that we need to be able to deal with change effectively later. So some of our work showed that if we systematically expose particular individuals to a specific routine, when they've been exposed to that specific routine for longer, and then when we change that routine, those individuals show more difficulties with changing that routine. That was just in a sort of experimental controlled setting. But we also found, using some retrospective informant reports, that it seems that families where they reported that with their children around preschool age, they tended to show more structure and structure routines more. Those individuals later in life, around sort of early adolescence, late adolescence, tended to be those that showed more difficulty with change and more resistance to change later. So that's a little bit of evidence in Prader-Willi syndrome. In typically developing children, there's some evidence to suggest that more engagement with unstructured rather than structured activities around age 6 to 7, so again sort of this early school period, seems to be associated with better task switching abilities in a particular type of task switching. And then there's also some computer models that try to model cognitive flexibility, and those data also show that if you restrict the training environment of the model to what would be akin to sort of a more structured, inflexible environment, then you get poorer performance of the model in task switching. So we wanted to then try to, well, our hypothesis was that increasing flexibility in routines and environments for young children with Prader-Willi syndrome will facilitate task switching development and lead to less resistance to change later in life. That was the hypothesis that we wanted to try to examine with an early intervention. And the way we did this was to try to come up with an approach that would strike them and the needed balance between structure and flexibility. So the best practice that I mentioned is there for a reason. We couldn't just go into a young person's life who is really sort of benefiting from structure and completely take structure away. That wouldn't be a sensible thing to do. But if we can try to balance that structure with enough flexibility to support the development of the task switching, then that could be helpful. And so that's what we're trying to do by collaborating with families to find out, first of all, how we needed to design this approach, and then to get some initial feasibility and acceptability data. So we collaborated with quite a few families who had children around the sort of preschool to sort of primary school age with Prader-Willi syndrome, and also some other conditions that are also linked to difficulties with task switching and resistance to change. And we identified what we call design requirements. And I haven't got a clock in front of me. I don't think I'll go through all of these just because I imagine that we don't have a huge amount of time to play
But
with.
about 4 minutes.
Okay, yeah, exactly. So I'll just pick out a couple of important ones. Really importantly, families told us that if we used game-like components to give children the perceived control over flexibility that we're trying to integrate into their routines, that would be a really good way to make children sort of get children to have a sort of buy-in into the approach. So if they feel that they're in control because we give them some kind of game to control, then that should help get children's buy-in. And families told us that technology to facilitate access would be good. So we made this a sort of web-based approach. And they also told us various things about how we should support the overall structure. So we should have a way to manage children's anxiety, and we should have a way of providing caregiver training. And so this is what it looked like. It's basically, it's a web-based application where parents have an area that they can use to plan the young person's routines. So they take any routines that the young person currently engaged in or that they feel need to be planned, and they can plan them into the system. And then critically, they can also plan in these flexibility points that we called wheel spins, that are points when the child will end up playing a game. And then the child has their own view that they can use to monitor how well they're doing at keeping to these routines. And then when they get to a point of program flexibility, they can play the game to decide which way a particular routine is going to go. So if you look at this this example here, we've got a flexibility point for the dinner time routine, and you can see there's various different small changes that could be made to that routine depending on what particular part of the dinner might be eaten first, or whether the child has to help like tidy away after the dinner or not. And the key thing is to start off with small levels of flexibility so that child can get used to playing the game, having control over that flexibility and playing, and then to build up the flexibility on an ongoing basis. And I'll just play you a quick example of what the child sees when they take control over playing the game to decide on which flexible way the routine is going to be done. So we evaluated it just in a small group of families. We just built. I mean, you can see that's it's clearly a prototype. We weren't able to build all the different parts of the application that we wanted to build, but the key things were there to give the child the control over the flexibility, to make it game-like, to give some sort of immediate reinforcement in the application when they've achieved the flexibility. And then we asked families to try it out for a couple of weeks and rate the flexibility and acceptability. And you can see that here in that acceptability and flexibility was close to maximum scores for two different measures. And also we talked to families about their experiences, and all of them felt that it was an approach that held promise. So we are thinking we'd really like to develop this further, and I suppose there's many reasons why we haven't been able to do that yet. Money is not the least of them, but I guess that some of that feeds into some questions that I thought I'd just put, because Shelley said it might be helpful to just have a few questions to perhaps spark discussion. So I guess one of the questions in our mind is, how do we evaluate the efficacy of this kind of early intervention, where our hypothesis is that what we're doing now won't be detrimental, but that we wouldn't see the benefits until much further down the line. How would we evaluate that appropriately when we'd, you know, in a sort of RCT type design, we'd basically be asking families to abstain from doing something for quite some time and then measure them up after several years. You know, how could we do that? And then similarly, if we're talking about that kind of approach where it's a preventative approach, so we're not expecting to see immediate benefits, how do we support families in sticking to an approach, even if we know that there's good efficacy data? How do we support families in sticking to an approach where they personally wouldn't see the benefits until much later? And then just thinking about critical periods, so Anastasia mentioned some really neat thinking around their identification of the right period for their intervention. I guess ours is a lot less rigorous. I feel it's not based on so much evidence, but how does, you know, if we're talking about critical periods for the development of particular cognitive processes, how do they interact with like a general profile of global intellectual disability that we see in Prader-Willi syndrome, and does that have any implications for how we would proceed with early intervention approaches? And that's it from me. So thank you very much.